Good morning. How's everybody doing this morning? Great. Awesome. My name's Nick Wagner. I'm a lead program manager working on the Windows UI platform. My focus is primarily on motion and animations, and I work for a team who's responsible for making it possible to build beautiful experiences on Windows. Now, throughout Build this year, you should have seen beautiful experiences cropping up all over the place. Kevin touched on it in the keynote, Joe hit on it in What's New, and Tim and James did a real case study yesterday. It should be clear that we fundamentally believe in helping you guys build beautiful experiences for your customers. Now, when I first started thinking about what I wanted to say today, I thought about putting together a big script to explain what beauty is and why it's important. But then I realized I'd be preaching to the choir. The very fact that you guys are watching this talk means that you guys already get it. You guys know that it's the combination of great functionality and beautiful experiences that keep your customers coming back time after time. Now, I'm really excited to be here this morning because we have a ton of cool features to show you. But I have to admit, when I first got asked to give this talk, I was a little bit nervous. I mean, I was asked to give a talk at 9 a.m. on Friday on the third day. I mean, how is that going to be interesting? Like, you guys have seen a bunch of great speakers. They all do a great job. How is it going to keep your attention? And that's when I realized maybe the best and only way to keep your attention is to go no slides, go deep, and just do a ton of cool demos. All right, so that's what we got lined up for you this morning. The only question that's left is where do we begin? And so I thought back to last year's build where I had the opportunity to help introduce composition in the visual layer. We introduced those APIs as a set of preview APIs where you could go ahead and play with them on the insider builds. This year, I'm very happy to say everything that we're showing you is either already available in the November update or will be made available as part of the anniversary update for you guys to use and ship. So with that in mind, I thought what better way than to kick things off than to take a look at a few real apps. And so without further ado, help me hand it over to Tristan Rice from Fitbit to show you what they've been able to do in a few short weeks.
Good morning, everyone. So my name is Tristan Rice. I'm a product manager at Fitbit, and I'm responsible for our Windows platform and Core UX teams. And so today I'm going to show you a little bit about some of the exciting things we've been able to do with Nick and his team. And I thought the best way to do that was to show you kind of what we have right now on our application and then what's coming in the future update. So some of the stuff we've implemented using the composition APIs from the November update and a little effects from Redstone. And so you can see this is definitely real bits. That is my actual heart rate coming from the track right now. So we should see it go down, hopefully. So this is our Windows 10 UWP. We released this starting middle of last year when Windows 10 became available, and we've been evolving since then. And we generally focus on trying to make sure it's a beautiful experience, that it both expresses Fitbit's design vision, but also matches to Windows 10. And so just going to give you a sample of, it's responsively designed, it scales up to different screen sizes beautifully, works for tablet and phone. And specifically, I'm going to show you a little bit of what it's like to have the phone experience, and then I'm going to switch to a device that's using an updated build with some of the new effects. So this is our dashboard, one of the main screens in the application. It shows a variety of data about your health and fitness status for the day. Apparently, I slept pretty well last night, hit my goal. And for those who may or may not know some of our features, we have challenges for people to socially engage with. So as you can see the structure of this page, very simple scrolling list. If I was to have an active challenge, the header image wouldn't necessarily appear, but you'd have a longer list to scroll through. And I'm going to show you a few of the other pages that we'll demo with some effects in a moment. So if I go to the account settings and my profile, I have a collection of badges from all of my accomplishments at Fitbit, or being a Fitbit user. And so if I just select one of these, it's a straight page load of a simple image on top of a gradient background. And from the PC, it shows nicely that gradient. So yeah, just a quick overview of kind of where the state of our app is right now. You notice the page transitions, just a quick switch. There's nothing special about it. And it can be a little jarring sometimes. So we'll switch over to the phone, and we'll show you what we've got coming. So here we go. So this is basically the same build as we were showing previously. The only difference is this is running on the latest, well, not quite the latest. It's running on 14.291. I haven't moved because once you get a demo stable, you don't move off of it. And so here we go. It's the dashboard again. And I'm going to show you, first of all, what happens when I pivot over to the Challenges tab. You notice there's a very smooth crossfade effect. Transitions that page in nicely for users. Again, it's about getting that feel of motion, getting that smoothness to the experience in place. And so with the Challenges page, we've got quite a few elements here on the page, and I just want to show you a little of the things we've done. So I'm going to slowly scroll up the page, and you'll notice there's an effect coming in place. A very subtle blur both in the background, and if you notice the button and the text blur out. Just nice and soft, subtle animation, nothing too dominating. And we did something else. I'm just going to back up 1 second. If I pull down, you can see the image stretching in the background, just something that makes it feel a little more playful in the experience. And then finally, we've got a scrolling effect. Once the cards get to the top, there's like a Z layer transition where the elements below will start overlaying, and then it hits a cap. We won't go any further. So you can kind of see from this a variety of things you can implement. Some of them subtle, some of them more highly visible, that kind of enhance the feel of the page and the user experience. So now I'm going to switch over to our badges and just give you a little show of what's going on. So here we went with something a little more ambitious, and hopefully this will load up on the Wi-Fi. OK, so we got my badge page here. So let's take one of these. And you probably saw a couple of things going on there, and so I'm going to play this back again. You saw something else there as well. So you'll notice the asset persistence of the icon as we go to the new page. And you'll also notice a bloom effect on the gradient background, where it blooms in from the point where the asset is navigating to. And so you get this nice continuity of the experience. And when you navigate back, the element moves back into its original position. And so everything here, aside from the blur effect, was done with what's currently available in TH2. It's all achievable today. And so these are just a few of the ways we've implemented them. We've got a lot of other ideas about how we can implement these in our apps to improve the feel of the application for our users. And so that's what we've got to show. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thanks, Tristan. Pretty cool to see what they were able to do. It was actually 3 weeks ago today where we actually dropped them the first build and the first SDK. It's not a lot of time to be able to pull that type of stuff off. So for the next demo, though, I want to switch gears a little bit, and I want to talk about something that you may not instantly associate with beauty, and that's work and productivity. Now, it's important to note that when I talk about beauty, it goes beyond eye candy and just aesthetics. Beauty is, as Tristan pointed out, you can use things like motion and effects to be able to help guide your customer's attention and to be able to move them through a scenario. It's by creating experiences like that that are crafted and complement what your user's trying to do that you can actually create an emotional connection. So to show this, I thought I would go ahead and bring up one of the Office apps, in this case Word. Let's see here. Every time. All right, here, we'll pull this guy up. All right, so the very first thing that I want to show you here is panning and zooming here. So as you can see, my finger's on the screen. It's panning. It's very smooth. It's stuck to the finger. As I let go, you get this nice, smooth inertia curve. Now, there's probably folks in the room going, like, why are you showing me this? Haven't you guys done this before? Like, I even know how to build this. And so for the most part, you'd be right. Most of the time, you can just use a XAML scroll viewer. It does a great job for things that look like scrolling and where you want to get that stick-to-the-finger experience and use the system behaviors out of the box. However, if you want to go and do something where you want that same type of feel, but you want to be able to customize parts of it, you basically fall off of a cliff. In some cases, it's not even possible to do it today. The way that Word is doing this is they're actually using something called an interaction tracker, and it gives them full control over all aspects of the experience. Everything from how it actually sticks to the finger to the inertia itself as it comes off of, as you lift your finger off the screen. Another thing that I want to draw your attention to here, let's go back somewhere, click Edit, is the cursor, the text caret, which I will insert somewhere eventually. All right, so you can see the caret there, and you see it blinking. It turns out that the human eye is really good at detecting motion. And so by blinking, it makes it very easy for the user to be able to find the cursor and orient themselves in the document. Another thing that you'll see is that as I type, the cursor actually animates. Now, you might think a small detail like that doesn't matter. But it turns out we've gotten a ton of positive feedback about it. We had one customer write us to say that animating that cursor felt as big of a leap as going from standard definition to high definition television. Some people even say that it helps them type faster. Now, I don't know whether or not that's actually true, but the very fact that there are stories like that being told shows you the power of motion effects to create that emotional connection. Now, there's another reason why I wanted to show you Word. So not only is the Office team true craftsmen, where they care about the subtle details that matter, but they also build industrial strength software. So for example, did you know that in Excel, you can have a worksheet that has over 1 million rows? That's over 20 million pixels just vertically. Like, they push the limits of our system, and they have some pretty intense requirements. The reason I'm calling this out is the way that they're achieving those or meeting those requirements is through the visual layer. It's ready for the prime time, and it's ready for you guys. Now, I want to show you that this isn't smoke and mirrors, so I'm going to go ahead and pop over here to Visual Studio, and I'm going to attach the debugger to Word. All right. And so the first thing you'll see is that there's a bunch of XAML controls. The Office team wants to use the right tool for the job, and they're using the XAML controls for the things like the ribbon and kind of the silhouette around the document. That way they get to go ahead and use some of the great features like data binding, accessibility, layout that are available right out of the box. Now, when they get to trying to make that pixel perfect document, that's where they're going to use the visual layer. So let's go over here and take a look at that. And you'll see here, you've got a series of sprite visuals here. That's the visual layer representing that document. And just to show you that it's real, let's go ahead and pick one of these guys, show its properties, change an angle here. There you go. So this is real. That's pretty cool. Now, those of you who may have missed the attendee party last night will realize that I actually just demoed another feature there. What you're seeing in Visual Studio is a preview of some of our tooling and debugging capabilities that are going to be coming to help support the visual layer. So now that we've opened up Visual Studio, I think it's time to embrace some code. All the code that we're about to show you is going to be available in our GitHub, and so we might move through it pretty fast, but you can download it and play with it at your leisure later. And with that in mind, let's bring up Dave Driver, our dev lead on rendering, to show us some shadows.
Thank you, Nick. So I'd like to walk you guys through a couple of features that we've added in the Windows 10 anniversary release. What I'm going to show you first is the application that I'm starting with. What I've got is a basic storefront application. You have a catalog of products, product images in a grid view, and a basic navigation panel. But these products are very flat. They don't jump out of the page at you. They don't give you that impression of that being a real thing that you can go obtain. So I'm going to use the Shadow API to make those things a little bit more exciting. The first thing I have to do is insert a location for the shadow. So I'm going to insert a rectangle immediately behind the image that represents the product. This composition image object that we're using for images is just a wrapper that's going to be a helper. It's a drop-in replacement for image that makes it easier to work with composition resources. James mentioned this in his talk yesterday. With that rectangle, we go back to our code behind. And when the page loads, I'm going to loop through all the products. And for each product, I'm going to attach a shadow. Now, attaching the shadow looks like this. Oops. Doesn't look like that. It looks like this. So we have a new drop shadow object that you can use. On that object, you can control the opacity and the blur radius of the shadow. You can control the shadow color. If you wanted to change it to a yellow, you can emulate a glow. Many things you can do with the shadow. And we're going to set the mask. By default, the shadows are rectangular. If you want a shadow of a different shape, you need to supply a mask to us, and we'll take that mask, use the opacity in that mask to determine what the shape of the shadow should be. In this case, I'm just taking the surface out of the composition image that we were using and using that as the mask. I then create a composition visual to host the shadow, and I'm going to bind the size and the offset of the image that represents the product to the size of the shadow, so that if those things change size or move, the shadow will follow them appropriately. And finally, we're going to add that new visual that contains the shadow to the visual tree using the element composition preview, which you may have seen in James's talk yesterday. Let me show you what that looks like. So now I've got a shadow, and Nick is throwing things at me.
That's right.
And it exists, but it's not really showing you that this thing is real. It doesn't look like it lives in a real world. So I think we can do a little bit better. The next thing I'm going to do, so I'm going to insert an additional visual. And on this visual, I'm going to apply a perspective transformation to the shadow that we're projecting. I have a helper here that creates a projection matrix that I can show you down here. It just says some shadow math that you can pull out of a graphics textbook, but ultimately returns a 4x4 matrix that we use as the transform on a parent visual. So let's go back up here. We create the projection. We set on that parent visual the perspective projection matrix, and then instead of binding the shadow visual into the tree, we're going to bind that parent into the tree. We made the shadow visual a child of the parent, so it's going to inherit that perspective transform. So now I have a very, very dark shadow sitting underneath each of these images. And it looks a little bit more real, but I think we can do even better. The first thing I'm going to do is fix that opacity. That's really too much of a shadow. And the next thing I'm going to do is I want that shadow to move. Shadows in real life don't move with the product. When the product moves, the lights stay in one place. And so we can make that, we can give the appearance of that happening as well. So instead of taking a matrix and setting the transform on the visual, instead I've created an expression. An expression is just a way to express a set of mathematical relationships between properties that the composition system can animate. That shadow expression, if I show it to you, is the same matrix math that we saw before, transformed into an expression and sent over to the compositor. But ultimately, it results in the same value, a matrix 4x4 that represents the projection. The one interesting thing is that we've modified that so that we can animate the light position. It's in a separate property set. I can bind additional animations to it so that light position can change dynamically. I then set up a position, an expression that describes the position of the light. For each of the elements inside the grid view, I'm going to find out how far they are from the light and bind an expression to that visual so that to the shadow of that visual that associates it with the light. And the light is sitting in front of the object and the plane of the surface is below. That was set up with our plane earlier. Let me show you what that looks like. So now, as I move my finger, those shadows parallax with the objects. And you can see it really well here on the taller objects with the shadow, with the light above. Now, because all we're doing is changing that perspective transform based on the position of the finger, this is a really efficient thing for us to do. We're not having to regenerate the shadows. We're not running any additional blurs frame over frame. But if that's what you need, we do support doing that. So if I modify one of those products to be something that's a little bit more live, you can see the shadow being generated frame over frame off of arbitrary D3D content. This is just a swap chain that we've taken, turned it into a composition brush, and used it to replace the surface that was one of our images with this animated content. That can be D3D, that can be a video, that can be any sequence of images that you want to choose. As soon as you change that mask, we're going to regenerate that shadow for you. It's a relatively subtle thing. You can see it on the screen, right? Good. So the thing that really makes this, I think, the most interesting is that we've tied elements of the scene into the user's interaction. And there are a lot more things that you can do with that. And I'm going to have Nick show you some of those.
Awesome. Thank you, Dave.
Thank you.
So I'm going to jump over here. Do you guys like that dolphin? I thought that was pretty cool. All right, so I'm going to use another app. I've got an app called Space News here. It's a very simple app. I'll run you through kind of the before. We basically just have a grid view here that's got a set of articles. It's kind of got a hero image. We can click over. You can see the actual image again. There's the article text. We can pop over here and see it kind of in this type of layout, or you scroll up. Now, I want to call out a few of the problems that we're going to go fix. So for example, if you look at it right now, it's really hard to read the text. Like, the image is great, but now I can't read the article. Another thing is, as you scroll up, the title just goes all the way off the screen. And what that means is that as I'm reading this, your users don't have the ability to actually keep track of where they're at. Like, it would be awesome if we could just keep that around. As we go back and forth, there's a bit of popping. Like, it's not a smooth transition, so we'll take a look at that. And then finally, we'll add some motion to this kind of the landing page and do several different techniques here. So the first thing that we're going to do, actually, let me go back and actually close it. First thing that we're going to do is we're going to actually work on making this text more readable. And we're going to do that using blur and tinting. Yesterday, James showed you how to use one of our reference implementations of a backdrop control. And we've already got that in there. And we're just going to animate the blur and the tint in order to make it better. Now, a very common pattern when you're trying to drive motion with input is that you want to be able to go between a specific value and an end value over a given range. And so we're going to create a helper function so that we can use this technique over and over in a couple of different places. So let's go ahead and start that. So I'll show you the implementation here. So you'll see we do some very simple variable setup, and then we've got this expression. So there's really two expressions that we're going to put together. The first one is just progress. And so the idea is we want to calculate how far through that range that we've gone so that we can use that to figure out how to interpolate between the two different values. And so all this is doing is it's creating a clamp where you're going to clamp it between 0 and 1. That way we know that if we're before the range, we'll be 0. After the range will be 1. And then we'll go ahead and normalize the value here. And so the way to look at this is if you pass in the end position, the whole thing will evaluate to 1. If you pass the start position, this first variable will end up being 0. The next thing that we do is we use kind of this expression, and we use it in a lerp function. And so all this does is it basically does a linear interpolation between the start and the end value based off of that normalized progress. Now you'll notice that the very first thing that I do is I do a replace. And so let me go take a look at that. And what you're seeing here is that we actually have a number of different types that we support in the animation system. And so for some of the more simple things like vector 2 and vector 3, a linear interpolation of the subchannels makes sense. But some of the more complex types like color, you actually want to interpolate in a better space. So for example, with color, you want to probably do it in HSL because you'll get a better set of color transitions. So let's go ahead and jump back. Once we've kind of got our expression set up, we'll go ahead and actually create the expression. This makes it ready to send over to the animation system so it can run it for you. And then we'll go ahead and wire in the values for it. All right, so now that we've got this guy, let's go ahead and use it. And so now I've jumped over to the full page. And I'm going to go ahead and set up a few different things here. So in the full page, you'll see the first thing that we do is we go get the compositor. And then we're going to go make this call to get scroll viewer manipulation property set. Long function name, but all it really does is it returns you back an object that you can then reference inside of your expressions so that you can actually do things like define how far the scroll viewer is inside there so that you can drive an animation. Next, we'll go ahead and set up the range that we want to go and animate over. And you'll see that it's 0 to 200. You'll notice that the number is negative. And the reason for that is if you think about scrolling, as you move something, you actually move it up. And that's a negative offset. Next, we'll go ahead and specify the values we want. And so in this case, it's a 0 to 40 for the blur radius. We'll use the function we set up, and then we'll start the animation on that backdrop control. And then we'll go ahead and do exactly the same thing for the color tint. So let me show you what that looks like. So we'll go over here, go go ahead and start panning up. And now you can see that nice blur, and it tints out, and now the text is very readable. Next thing we want to go do is we want to go and take care of that text. And so what we're going to do is we're going to try to keep that merging galaxies text line, and we're going to actually shrink it down and keep it on screen the whole time. The other content like Hubble views and the byline, we'll go ahead and just fade it out. So let's go pop back over here. Let's see here, I'm on 2D2. All right, so the first thing that we do is we go get a couple of different visuals. And you'll see that there's a floating title visual and the original visual. Now, the reason why we're doing this is as you transition from page to page, there's a subtle opacity animation that comes in. And if we were to immediately go and show another visual, it'll pop. And we don't want any pops. This very first method here, all it does is it goes ahead and takes that text block, creates a new text block, parents it to something that's above the scroll viewer so that you get out of the clip, and then copies over the variables. So now that we've got our visuals, let's go ahead and set up the actual animations. Again, we're going to do the exact same thing as before. We're going to figure out the range that we want to animate through. And then this time we're going to do it slightly differently. We're going to actually create an expression so that as it moves, actually, the first thing that we need to do is we need to be able to switch between the two different visuals now. So we have one that's sitting outside the scroll viewer and one that's in. And so the way that we'll do that is we'll use this ternary operator here. And all this does is basically say that when you get to the top, go ahead and flip the opacity from 0 to 1. We'll go ahead and set that, and then we take advantage of the fact that our animations are actually templates, and you can reuse them. And so we'll go ahead and update the expression, and we'll do the inverse of it, and then we'll set it on the other guy. So this way, when one changes from 0 to 1, the other one's guaranteed to go back the other way. All right, so now we've got the guy moving, or we've got the guy flipped. Now we have to actually get it moving, because before it was moved by the scroll viewer. Now that it's not in there, it doesn't move. All right, so this is the code that actually moves it. And you'll notice here that I've actually passed in the expression string at the end, calling it out because there's a couple of different styles that people like. Some people like to define the math up front and then fill the variables in after. Some people want to define their variables and then kind of do the math. It's really a style choice. It's up to you. Just want to call out, you get to pick what you want. This is the expression that actually moves it. All we're doing is we're setting the initial offset so that it's actually positioned without any scrolling over the guy, and then we're moving it along with scrolling. And then the last thing we're going to do is we're just going to take the max between two values so that when it hits the top of the screen, it stops moving. Here's the code that actually scales the guy down. It's that same technique, so I'm not going to walk through the code. We're just scaling it down 40%. And then last thing we're going to do, same technique, we'll fade out the opacity. Let me show you that guy. All right, so as we pan up, it just continues to move, and then you see it start shrinking down, sticks there, the content fades out, and your context is preserved. Awesome, thank you. The next thing that we want to take a look at is let's start putting some motion in here. And so the technique we're going to use is a form of parallax. Now, most people are familiar with basic parallax, where you take something in the foreground and you move something in the background. In this case, what we're going to do is we're going to do what I call windowed parallax. And we're actually going to take the image itself, scale it up, and then as we're moving, we'll actually parallax the image within each item. So let me show you how that's done. We'll pop over here, and we'll go ahead and create another helper function so that we can apply it easily to each of the articles. The first thing to note is you'll notice that these are basically the same variables that we use in the normalized expression. And it's exactly right, because this is just going to wrap that same technique and do some math to figure out where things are at. Next, we go ahead and grab a few variables. An interesting one to call out here is the scale. We're going to use the scale to figure out how fast things should move, and so that we always keep pixels on the screen. And then the other thing we need to calculate is actually where in the scroll viewer you're at. So similar to in the shadows demo, you need to know where it's at so that you only want it to parallax where the user can actually see it. It doesn't really make any sense to try to parallax it way off the screen. So now that we've got that, let's go ahead and define a few axis-oriented variables. All we're doing here is basically grabbing a few things like the sizes, the offsets, the scales, and we're doing that on the per axis so that we can do the math. All right, so here's the actual math. The idea here is that when the article is just off the screen to the bottom, we'll go ahead and orient the image to the bottom. And then when it's just off the edge to the top, we'll go ahead and orient it so that the image is at the very top. We'll go ahead and set up the animation itself using the normalized transition, and we'll start it. Let's see here. Let's see what I need to do here. All right. So now we actually have to wire the guy in. So let's do that. So what I have here is a helper function inside of the articles themselves. This gets called in a bunch of different places like onload, size change, that sort of thing. First thing we do is we just make sure that we're ready, check to make sure the image is actually opened, that we have all the right layout values. We go ahead and apply that scale, again, the thing that's going to dictate how fast, and we go ahead and start it. Now, here's that effect. Awesome, thank you. The next thing that we want to do is we actually want to work on that page transition. Now, I waited until now to do it because there's a couple of different techniques you can use. Out of the box, XAML provides something called the Connected Animation Service, and it'll allow you to take a UI element and transition it from one page to the next. Now, in our case, we've gone ahead and customized what's going on with that image. And so we need to actually be able to participate that. And so we've implemented a helper class that does the same strategy as what XAML's doing, but then allows us to go ahead and animate things like that brush, offset, and scale that you just saw. Let's go over there. The helper, I'm not going to walk you guys through the helper class today. We have a pre-recorded talk that you guys can go watch, Varun gave. He walks through the strategies that's there. He walks you through kind of what you can do with the XAML one and what you can do with kind of this helper class. Today, I'm just going to show you kind of the customizations that we need to do. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to define this method. It's going to be a delegate for this transition. And all I'm doing here is I'm going ahead and taking kind of its existing state and animating it to its final state. The way that I'm doing that is actually through this thing called an expression keyframe. And so far you've seen us use expressions all over the place to kind of relate a set of variables to kind of what the animation's supposed to be. In this case, what we're doing is we're using kind of the more familiar keyframe animation, but then using the power of expressions to define what that value you should be is. And so what you'll see here is rather than hard coding the final like 100% scale and a 0-0 offset, we're actually just referencing the object and using its scale and offset to be able to animate it. So now that we have the delegate set up, last thing to do is to go wire this in. And I'll show you, actually. So all I did is I passed in my delegate, I used it, and then I clicked run very, very quickly because I'm excited. This is pretty cool. Check this out. Let me go back for you. Awesome. I'll do it one more time just for fun. All right. So I promised you that I would show you how you can actually customize how input drives animation. And so we're going to do that by taking a look at these articles themselves. It would be nice if you're able to touch down on it and actually dismiss the ones that you didn't want to see. And so we'll use the interaction tracker for that. Now, the one thing I want to call out is that there's a spectrum of things that the UI platform can do. There's things that are very easy, and then there are things that are possible. This one is definitely on the side of possible because it gives you tons of flexibility and control. And so we're going to lay down a fair bit of code to be able to light this up. All right, so let's jump over here. So the first thing that I'll show you here is I've already taken the liberty of putting the swipe dismiss panel into my XAML. And I did that just so that I don't have to type a bunch of code into XAML in multiple places because I inevitably get that wrong. So the swipe dismiss panel hasn't actually been implemented yet, and it's basically just a user control, and it implements this interface. This interface is what allows the interaction tracker to be able to tell you what's going on inside of the animation system, like where the thing's actually at. These callbacks happen asynchronously, so just something to keep in mind. Now the wiring up of the interaction tracker we're going to do in 3 parts. The first thing we're going to do is create and configure an interaction tracker. Then we're going to go handle the input state machine. And then finally, we're going to wire up the motion. So let's get started here. So you'll see I've already got some basic event handlers wired up. And so first thing we do is we go grab the visual in the compositor. We then go and set a couple of properties. Way to think about this is the threshold dictates how far you have to swipe for it to actually be a dismiss. And then the offset defines how far away the thing should actually finish when inertia is done. Next, we'll go ahead and create the interaction source. This is the guy that actually associates input into the animation system. And so the way to the first call here that's kind of interesting is this create. And you'll notice we pass in a visual. And that's because we need to be able to understand how to, or in what coordinate space to actually consume the input. And so we'll do that based off of the visual that's passed in. Next, we'll say that we want to enable tracking on the X mode and with inertia. And then finally, we'll set the redirection mode to off so that we can do the hit testing and then only turn this on for touch. Finally, we go ahead and we create the interaction tracker itself, and we associate that interaction source with the interaction tracker. All right, so now we have an interaction tracker, but we need to actually configure inertia. And so let's do that. There's a couple of concepts here. There's inertia, before I type it in so that you guys can actually hear versus running away with the code. There's a resting value here. And the idea of a resting value is that there's 2 things for it. It's a condition and then a value. And the idea is that when the condition evaluates to true, that is actually where we will update inertia to end at. And so this allows you to implement things like snap points or boundary effects and those sorts of things. So let me go ahead and show you that code. You'll see right here, we go ahead and we create the condition where you're just using a very simple expression that evaluates to a Boolean. And then we use another expression to basically say where the thing should end. And so what this does is it checks to see if it's past the threshold to the left, make sure the inertia actually ends to the left. We do the same thing for the right. And then you'll notice the last one we do is true. And so the way that this works is the order in which you insert these resting values matters. The first one we find that evaluates true is the one that we pick. And so by setting this last one to true, we're guaranteed that we'll either snap left or right, or we'll end up right back in the middle. All right, now that we've got those up, the only thing that's left is we go ahead and we fill in the variables that we reference in the expressions, and then we actually modify inertia. Last thing to do in the constructor here is we actually add a handler for a pointer pressed event. And the reason why we're doing this here is we actually wanted to handle the event during the tunneling phase so that we get first crack at it. All right, so that's all of the basic setup. Now let's go take a look at the interaction state machine. So we'll go look at pointer pressed. We do a very simple check here to see if it's touch. If it's not touch, we bail out. If we've already started, if we haven't started any animations before, we'll go ahead and start them. And then last, we'll go ahead and actually associate the input with that interaction tracker or the interaction source. This is the thing that actually gets things moving on screen. Next, you'll see that we have this value change callback. All we're going to do is cache it. And then when things stop moving, we're going to use that cached value to go ahead and do kind of our logic. All we're checking here is to see if if the absolute position is greater than 1. This accounts for any floating point errors, and it's just checking to see if we've snapped left or snapped right. If we are, we fire the event, and then we clean up the animations. Last, let's actually make some stuff move. So 16. So here are the animations that we're going to hook up. And so you'll see the first thing that we do is a very basic, just stick to the finger. We set up the expression, we reference the tracker, and then we bind that offset to the panel itself. Next, we're going to hook up a couple of properties that we're going to expose out so that we can do some cool stuff. This basically just creates another progress animation similar to the one that I showed earlier, but this time it's going from -1 to 1. And then we're going to set that on a property set that we give out so that other people can go ahead and use that to do cool things. Like, for example, maybe drive an opacity animation, which I'll show you how to do. So let's jump over and actually wire up the very last bit here. All right. So what you see is we wire up the event handler. We just do some basic figuring out which item it is, going ahead and removing it from the collection. And then last, we go ahead and set up the opacity. It's a very simple equation where we're just referencing it and then subtracting it out. So let's go show you that. Eventually. All right. We may have to try this again. Yep. I've had a 50% success rate. All this shows is this is early bits and real code. All right, let's move this along. As you can tell by the fact that I have Task Manager up, ready to kill it just in case it happened. Say no to that. All right, be my friend this time. Things are moving, great. All right, now take a look. Now you'll see we can slide it over, and we've got the stick to the finger. We're driving an opacity, and that's pretty cool. Now, I want to actually show you one more thing, because this is cool, but I think we can do way better. So let me go back. So where we did opacity, I actually want to reference something that you haven't been able to use before. We're actually going to take the velocity and do something with it. So let me show you what we can do here. All right, so what we're going to do here is we're going to take the velocity, the actual speed of how fast that's moving, and we're going to set up an expression that will actually bind that to the rotation. And this can make it feel much more natural to human beings and not like cold, stiff, mechanical parts. So let me show you it now. And I have to admit, this is my favorite part. All right, here we go. Ready? And if you let go over here, beautiful. Awesome. So this shows you some of the power of how you can tie input to drive animations, and it shows you a bunch of cool effects that you can do. To take it one step further, I want to hand it back over to Dave to show you what you can do with lighting.
It kind of seems like it needed its own talk, don't you think?
Luckily, we do have a pre-record that you can watch where we go into much more detail on the interaction tracker. So go check it out.
Okay. So I'm going to show you some additional things that you can do with animation, effects and lighting. So first, I'm going to start with show you the application we're starting with. So what I've got is a basic travel or trip tracking application, a list of cities you might want to visit. In each city, a list of locations, restaurants, points of interest, a flip view with imagery of the city. And for each of these locations, some information about the location. You can check in, see the number, see reviews, things like that. First thing I want to do is enable a bunch of the features that Nick has already shown you. I just have a global bool to flip to turn those on, because everybody loves globals. This is going to enable the connected animations that Nick showed you, item parallax, or the windowed parallax, and the shy headers, the headers that kind of get out of the way of the content as you're scrolling. So now each of those images is moving with the pan, the header gets out of your way, and when you navigate to the new page, the element you clicked on moves up into the flip view. There are still a bunch of things that we can do with this. We have things that kind of pull you out of that experience that are still not as lively as you'd like from a travel experience, and that kind of detract from the rich imagery that this application has. First thing I'm going to start with is this nav bar. It really takes you out of the experience of the application. So think we can fix that. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make the background for that pane transparent. And I'm going to add a backdrop panel, which, if you went to James's talk yesterday, he also showed you. And here I've set an existing tint color and a mode that we want to use for the tint. And so now when they pop that open, you're no longer being kind of kicked out of the experience of the application to look at this big, dark menu. You get the elements of the thing bleeding through, but you can still read the content here. Let me pop through in and show you a little bit about how the backdrop panel is implemented. So the core of that is the effect graph that we build. It's the same effect graph that you might have seen in the Windows 10 refresh, where you take a blur and combine that with a blend. And the blend is just taking a foreground color and the blurred content and mixing them together. But the real magic comes down here when we supply the source parameter. This source is using a new brush type that we have in the Anniversary Preview called the backdrop brush. And this will take the rectangle of the content behind the visual and use that as input to your effect graph. That will work if the visual is transformed, if it's rotated, if there's perspective on it. We do all of the right things to incorporate that content in the correct way as part of that effect graph. And with that, you have the full power of our effect system. It's relatively easy to add additional effects to the pipeline to get a different result. And so now instead of just taking the blur effect, I'm going to take some desaturation and include that as part of that effect. And now the content's all desaturated. Now we talked a little bit about legibility, both in Nick's talk and earlier when I was talking about the panel itself. We have a little bit of a legibility problem with the text on this page, particularly if you see Portland gets lost in the image. Now I've already shown you some shadows, but let me show you a couple of additional things that you can do with those. So just as I did earlier, I'm going to go ahead and add in, oops, sorry. I'm going to go ahead and add in a reference point for the shadow, and I'm going to wire shadow in to when the text block size is resolved. Now this is the same piece of code that we saw before. The one piece of the code that's really different is where I'm getting the mask. I'm getting this mask directly from the shadow, from the text blocks element itself. So in addition to making things easy and making things possible, we're trying very hard to make the transition between those two, between the visual layer and the framework layer easier. And this is one of the parts of that. You can now get alpha masks off of text and alpha masks off of shapes inside XAML and use those as part of when you're using the visual layer. And so I can show you what the result of that is. Now the text is quite a bit more readable, even on top of the white backgrounds, with just a very subtle shadow. So there are a couple of other things I want to do. This helps draw your eye when you transition the page. I'd like to keep people's attention on the top because it will help them notice that there's a flip view at the top. So I'm going to apply an effect to that connected transition. So I've prepared an effect graph, and this is a really simple one. It just pops the exposure of the image. I've got it in a separate file so that they can be initialized at the beginning when the application loads. It does take some small amount of time for the effect to initialize, and if you want it to be ready immediately when you do the transition, it's nice to set those up ahead of time. Oops. And then in the same location that Nick customized his transition, I'm going to customize mine. Now, the connected animations have two pieces. They really have the source content, which is, in this case, the surface brush, that is the element of the content that's moving from one page to the next. And they have a sprite that contains that brush while the while the element is moving and the page is transitioning underneath. And I'm going to modify both of those. I'm going to create the exposure effect, and I'm going to set the surface brush, the content of that transition, as the content of that effect. And then I'm going to replace the brush on the sprite that's holding the content for the transition with my new effect. And I've also taken the length of the transition animation, and I'm going to have my effect run past the end. So what's going to happen is, at the point of the ramp interval, that's when the element is going to land. So the exposure is going to pop up and then trail off over a period of 8 seconds after landing in the new page. So the expression comes up, and while that animation is running, you can still interact with the flip view. So. Now, the last thing that I'd like to show you, we've been promising you a little bit of lighting for the whole talk, I think the whole talk. So I'm going to jump a little bit into the lighting infrastructure that we have in the anniversary refresh. It's a reasonable amount of code, but I'm going to walk you through the core piece of it. Again, we've subscribed to the container content changing event, which you've seen in other talks. When that content changes, we're going to do two things. We're going to make sure that the lighting has been set up. And for the image that is the element of the list view, we're going to attach the lighting effect to that. To set the lighting up, I have, again, an effect graph. In this case, I'm taking a light, which is this point diffuse effect. We have point diffuse, point specular, spot diffuse, and spot specular support in the anniversary refresh. And all of those effects will take the parameters that you specified, the location, and will create a light map. So an image that ramps from black to white, or whatever color you choose for your light, that you can then include in your effect graph in other ways. In this case, what we're doing is we're just taking the content of the image, we're taking the content of the light map based on the position of the light, and blending that in with the image. The other thing I wanted to call out is this parameter. This is the height map that we use. And that tells the light effect some information about the texture and structure of the content in the image. Down at the bottom here, I'm loading that from an image that represents beveled edges. So it gives you heights of an element that kind of go up on the sides and are flat on top to give you a kind of diamond cut, jewel-like shape. And on the lighting, and we're going to animate the light position. What we're going to do is we're going to use this light to create a virtual scroll bar. So I've made an expression, takes the width of my grid, attaches the light to the right of the grid, starts at the top of the grid, and as we scroll up, moves the light down. We have that expression, and I can show you what that looks like. So now you can see the beveled edges, and as I move, the light moves on the right-hand side of the screen. And in particular, here, you can kind of see the effect of the light on the edges of that image. Give it a little bit more lifelike attitude. So I think we've shown you 5 different classes of applications. All of which have benefited from the addition of motion and effects to create a more engaging experience for the user. In some cases, those effects were subtle. In some cases, not so subtle. But in all of those cases, they've enhanced the intent of the application and enhanced the way the user wants to use those things. We're actually really excited to my mouse was in the wrong place. We're really excited to hear from you guys about what you're able to build with these tools that we've been able to show you. All of the code that we have is going to be up on the GitHub, the Windows UI DevLabs GitHub, and there are additional existing samples for UWP. If you have any questions, please follow us on Twitter, ask us questions. We'll also be available after this in the hub in the beautiful UX booth.
Awesome.
Thank you very much.